Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for Actual Tech Media's weekly Roundup show. Today, we're going to be talking about data and databases, and we've got a special guest today who specializes in this area. I don't, so I'm happy to be moderating this conversation. So before we get started, let me introduce you to our guests. First of all, of course, I've got my business partner and the CEO at Actual Tech Media, Scott Lowe, who has two passions in life, cats and databases. And so he's a perfect guest for today's show. And then we've also got, you didn't even laugh. We also got Joey D'Antoni,
I don't know what to say.
Who is principal consultant at Denny Cherry and Associates Consulting. Joey builds and architects and fixes poorly architected databases all day long. It is going to be an awesome contributor for this conversation. So thank you guys for joining today.
Thanks, Scott.
If you're on the live stream, please post comments or questions that we can respond to. We'd love to make this a sort of interactive conversation, but we have a few things here to kick it off. This week, Joey and I took a briefing with Couchbase, and they've got a new product announcement around version 7. And so some of the talking points from that briefing brought up some interesting ideas that we'd like to discuss further. So I'm going to start with a question out to you, Joey. Couchbase told us about a number of things, just very big picture, that are reasons that customers come to, they're looking for something other than their, whatever it is, on-prem SQL server that they're accustomed to. And I want to get some color from you on some of these things. Databases are failing modern performance demands. So here's my question. Are they? And if so, how?
I can take that as a yes and no. I've worked with a lot of customers. I have one customer who works with real estate data that's got effectively a 50 terabyte database with billions of rows, and it hums along. Granted, it's on some big hardware. The server it runs on has almost 2 terabytes of RAM. I've worked with other customers that are more transactional, where they can do 13 million transactions a second on a single box. However, there's the other end of the spectrum where you have applications that just don't have, well-optimized schemas. Maybe their indexing is poor. The way that the calls are getting made to the database is poor. Lots of dynamic SQL and entity framework type workloads. Those sorts of things don't scale. Or even to an extent, when you go really large scale in a software as a service type application, you really need to think about from the beginning how you're going to horizontally scale your databases, because otherwise you're stuck in that buying an ever bigger box problem. And I think one of the things Couchbase does is offer kind of easy horizontal scale without you having to think about it from the very beginning of your application, because you can simply add nodes. And I think it does it with a SQL footprint in a way that it doesn't exactly make it a one-for-one replacement for a relational database, but it makes the shift a little bit easier.
So from a performance and a capacity standpoint, my understanding is that there are plenty of environments that you work on where it's not that the database engine can't do the task, it's that it was architected in a way that does not support the requirements. So it sounds like, if I'm hearing you correctly, one of the neat things about Couchbase is that the inherent architecture makes it easy to do right. Is that true?
Yeah, there's kind of a secondary indexing solution they have. It's a little bit more developer friendly in general. I find we come across a lot of application developers who don't really understand the way databases work and how they need to index the columns they're seeking on and not just scan the table. In the JSON nature and the secondary indexing nature of Couchbase, I think makes that a little more fun of mind for developers. It's a database. I'm sure you can still implement terrible, awful things in it if you try hard enough.
So another one of the reasons they're saying customers turn to Couchbase is to drive down total cost of ownership. So I suppose it could be true that what Couchbase would call legacy tools, that they can do it, but it ends up being egregiously expensive. What do you?
So I think whenever I see a data vendor make that comment, it's usually targeted at Oracle licensing. Specifically, Oracle Enterprise Edition is like orders of magnitude more than SQL Server. It's, I think the list price is $45,000 a core. Plus, there are a lot of options. So, like if you want compression, or you want partitioning, or you want a number of other features, those costs some percentage of $45,000 a core. SQL Server, I think, is a little bit more fairly priced, but it's still pretty substantial. You're still looking at $7,000 a core. And if you have a beefy workload, those costs can get pretty high. I think in general, it's more of a scale cost too. Like those big numbers get multiplied as you grow. I don't think the cost is as dramatic, but that's a very appealing message to particularly Oracle customers. I have Oracle trying to audit one of my customers right now, and they have 2 standard edition licenses, and they're auditing them for, I don't know why.
Seems kind of egregious.
Yeah.
Okay, last one, and then we'll move on to our next point. They mentioned Couchbase customers need to be able to deliver incredible mobile experiences. What is it about the Couchbase secret sauce that's especially well suited to those sorts of mobile or IoT sort of applications?
I've kind of traditionally thought of Couchbase, and they do this, but I've always kind of thought of them like as a Redis kind of key value store competitor, where you're delivering small result sets that are very frequently run to a lot of customers. And by using that key value storage method, you can potentially have things in a slower data store, like in their case, JSON, where the database engine will store those frequently run query results in that key value store and just act as a results cache. So devices that are low bandwidth aren't having to make big transactions, and they're able to just quickly grab a key value pair of result sets or pairs of result sets that they might need.
So from a functionality standpoint, one of the major announcements in this 7.0 release is the addition of some RDBMS-like features or ways to easily transiting RDBMS onto Couchbase's platform. So at this point, the Couchbase platform covers key value store, document database, relational database, search engine, and real-time analytics, where in a lot of cases, folks are using a unique piece of database software to address each of those needs. Scott, I made the comment in the briefing that I think a lot of folks who are operating at significant scale tend to pick best in breed solution for each of those needs. So, Joey just mentioned Redis, which is probably a best in breed example in that scenario. What are your thoughts on, for a data platform, the trade-off can be great and effective, especially economically and for your operations, versus doing best in breed for each of these things, especially at significant scale?
One of the things that struck me was exactly what you just said, is they're sort of bringing the RDBMS world a little bit more into I don't want to say modern, but a more modern type of platform. And I'm going to focus on that for a second, which is basically these RDBMS constructs, and why I think it's really kind of cool that Couchbase is bringing these into the future in their platform. Number one, we already have a ton of trained both database admins, sysadmins, and others that understand the world of RDBMS. They understand the SQL Server query language. They understand how databases relate to one another and how data works in a more traditional RDBMS world. One of the stickiest problems with moving to anything new, regardless of how new it really is retraining the people. And when we think about a modern platform like Couchbase, the people training aspect of that is astronomically difficult, especially when you start thinking about having to get a net new skill set. That's the old problem of, I want to hire people with 20 years of experience in this thing that's only 5 years old. Well, you can kind of do that now because of the fact that they're bringing, even with Nickel, their SQL-like query language, they're almost identical SQL-like query language to a more modern database construct. And I think from those perspectives, they get a lot closer to being able to be an all-in-one sort of solution. Whereas, trying to go to best of breed, I think that really large-scale applications, there's going to always be that, do we go with the solution that ekes out every little bit of performance and has every possible feature in every single one of these categories, or do we go with the one that we can have a common platform where we can train people up to become experts in this single platform instead of having to deal with nuances from across all of these different products. So I think it's the age-old build versus, not build versus buy, but best of breed versus all-in-one, like with any software application, that organizations are going to have to make that distinction about feature set, completeness of feature set for a specific silo versus being able to have something that's more simpler to adopt across the enterprise, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and the trade-offs there strike me as similar to ones that we talk about a lot in data protection, which is that, to get all the way to 98% coverage has about the same expense as to eke out that last 2%. And that
right.
seems to be kind of what we're dealing with here too, is in a lot of these workloads that we're discussing, you can probably deal with the 98% or the 99%. There are probably those out there that need that last 1%, and it's going to be exponentially more difficult and expensive to get there. But if you need it, you need it. Joey, what are some of the challenges of using multiple different data stores to build an application and across teams and stuff like that?
I think the biggest, and it's something that we've seen a lot, it's gotten easier because in the past you would have had to have deployed a bunch of VMs, or in the not far distant past, you would have had to have deployed a bunch of physical servers to each run a different service. But with cloud and containers and like platform as a service offerings, it does become a little bit easier to, maybe drop in a graph database here for one thing, or drop in a key value store here for a cache. But the real challenge of doing that is each one of those things has their own SDK, right? So you're having to have your developers that kind of know, and your DevOps folks that know how to manage, whether it be like Elasticsearch for search or Redis for key value. And you have all these like little niche products, and some of which are widely used, like Redis and Elasticsearch, others that are less widely used, like Gremlin for graph. Those things become narrow, and it's harder to find that expertise or even just resources to do that thing. And I think by bringing all this together, Couchbase has a pretty compelling story there, because you get a lot of the benefits of what we would call polyglot persistence, which is a fancy way of saying you're storing your application's data in the right kind of data store for the right kind of data, while at the same time kind of offering a single development experience, which that to me is where the ultimate benefit lies from a just pure DevOps standpoint. Your devs only need to know one tool, and your operations folks kind of only need to know one tool, even if it's different parts of it.
Yeah, so I kind of wanted to circle back to that. On the product announcement for Couchbase 7, there's basically three main features or takeaways that they're promoting for this release. One is faster operational performance and lower TCO. So I don't want to spend too much time there. It's like performance improvements and cost improvements on the next version. Awesome, love it. Another is that they're doing this more transactional sort of RDBMS-like thing. So let's talk a little bit more about that, because you just mentioned the portability of the Nickel query language to a number of contributors to database projects. So DBAs and developers and analysts. And so by adding this transactional capability, they're able to replicate a lot of the things that we would do with more traditional RDBMS tools. How would you say adding that functionality changes the way that folks might approach Couchbase as a platform? Does that? That's not a very good question. Let me ask you this.
I think I can run with that. I think in the past, especially with kind of the time frame I like to get back to is 2011 and 2013, when the heyday of NoSQL platforms, when everybody said relational databases couldn't scale. I think those things, all of those tool sets that we saw, whether they were HBase or Hadoop or to an extent Mongo, and there were a handful of other ones I'm forgetting, those all had separate SDKs, so they were far different. Nobody could write SQL against them. That's a big problem. The other thing was just consistency. There were there was a big movement for eventually consistent data because it was faster to skip writing to a transaction log, which is great for, your web logs, but it's not so great for the transactions for your website where you're actually selling something. So I think being able to kind of combine that NoSQL and transactionalize things is something that's not just from a pure development standpoint, but I also think from a sales standpoint, that sounds a lot more compelling than, hey, you can use this and it's eventually consistent. They're kind of saying you can use this in a transactional system and at the same time maintain nearly the same development. I'm sure patterns are slightly different, but overall the experience for your developers is going to be not that different from developing against a relational database.
So we've discussed sort of the day two operational implications. There's also, as we've discussed a little bit, the kind of day one moving from one platform to another, or, in the past, it would have meant re-architecting the way the application is built. The other kind of flagship feature of this release is new data containment structures. Can either of you explain what those are and how that helps us make the transition over to the Couchbase platform?
Go ahead, Joey.
Okay. Effectively, what they're trying to do, they've broken down to containers or buckets, containers, and I think objects, and they're mapping. Too. Yeah, and it's mapping to tables and schemas, or schema and table. So it's almost a one-to-one mapping for a relational database where you would have a set of schemas and tables that you would bring in to that Couchbase database. So effectively, it makes it a really quote unquote easy mapping solution. Not having used it, it's a little hard for me to say, and I don't know how well that scales when you get to millions and billions of rows. They say it does, so I'll take their word for that. But I don't know the practicality of the like physics of importing a 2 terabyte database into there.
Sure. Go ahead, Scott.
There's always going to be a challenge in these kind of migrations. Even I think the term that you would use is data gravity, right? I mean, it's the data wants to stay where it is. So there's going to have one of the challenges that we used to see with migrating these sorts of legacy applications into something new was they were so different that Joe, you touched on this, is there's a wholesale re-architecture of an application that has to happen. So in addition to retraining your people, you've got to refactor applications, and that combination is incredibly difficult. The new constructs, adding more traditional looking constructs to the platform really eases the migration because it looks like something people are already familiar with. And from an application development perspective, it's sort of one-to-one as much as it can be when you're making a change like that. So the combination of skills and on both the admin side as well as the development side, I think is a pretty powerful enabler for what Couchbase is trying to do with version 7 and making the world look a little bit more like it used to, while still providing some of the services that we've come to expect from emerging platforms.
Cool. And for folks that are interested, I'll just mention a couple of on the faster operational performance and lower TCO claim, a couple of the improvements here they're calling out: faster failover and faster rebalancing when you're rebuilding nodes. Those are obviously big when, especially these massive scale applications that we're talking about. The difference between a 26-second failover and a 6-second failover here they're quoting, like that's significant when you're running at a massive scale. Or rebuilding nodes, if I'm reading this right, it says 2,000% faster. Up to 50 buckets test improved from 2 hours 45 minutes to 7.5 minutes. So to put it in the storage terms, they rebuilt their RAID controller so that it rebuilds a lot faster, basically. Yeah, and to rebuild and be back to full resilience and performance capacity in 7.5 minutes instead of 2 hours and 45 minutes, that's huge. So I kind of glossed over this claim earlier, but these are big deliveries in this release. So cool stuff there too. Okay, that's all the main points that I had to cover. I've got a few things for the audience as we wrap up, but Scott, Joey, anything else you wanted to point out or touch on before we wrap it up?
I think it's a really compelling product. I think the notion of being able to easily horizontal scale and horizontally scale quickly is really attractive to developers, because that's something that's very difficult to do in a traditional relational database. People have done it, there are design patterns for it, but you really, really have to think about it and develop carefully. And distributed databases are pretty hard. And if they've done a lot of that work for you, it can make it a lot easier.
Great. Well, folks, we know that evaluating tools like this one and other new ways to do better is really important, but also can be very time consuming. And to help you in that endeavor, on August 18th, we're hosting a virtual summit entitled IT Renovation Day, analyzing the next wave of tools, products, and services. We would love to have you join us for that. Couchbase is going to be presenting on that event, along with lots of others who will be telling similar stories about how you can improve and build cool new things. So August 18th, sign up at events.actualtechmedia.com, and we'd love to have you there. Scott, Joey, thanks so much for this chat today. I had a lot of fun and I learned a few things.
Thanks very much, everyone.